The hardest thing for a documentary to accomplish is to function as a sort of tourist guide. To begin with, it is necessary to possess the quintessential qualities of a tourist guide, that spontaneity which can only be achieved after countless repetition of a specific body of knowledge. And furthermore, I ignore whether anyone watching a documentary is prompted to think about tourists. Tourists belong to a category that is defined by quickness, quick visits to places, quick snapshots to remember such visits, and quick conclusions about everything becoming a distant landscape, given that the only tangible notion that we can find within our grasp is the concept of a tourist. With that in mind, I believe that in approaching the major temple, it is most convenient to assume the condition of being a traveler. Carlos Monsiváis was born in Mexico City in 1938. He attended the National Preparatory School and the School of Philosophy and Literature at Mexico's National University. He was a Fellow of the Mexican Writers Center and the Center for International Affairs at Harvard University. His works include Antología de la Poesía Mexicana del Siglo XX, Nuevo Catecismo para Indios Remisos, Días de Guardar, A Ustedes Les Consta, Amor Perdido, Entrada Libre, Los Rituales del Caos, Escenas de Pudor y Liviandad, to name a few. Being emblematic of critical thinking in Mexico, Monsiváis' lengthy career as an essayist and journalist has turned him into an outstanding figure of Mexican cultural life. In this journey through the Museum of the Major Temple, or Templo Mayor, Monsiváis puts forward fresh ideas about Mexico's past and present by exploring the symbols of deep ritual energy lying buried at the roots of our own nationality. What does a traveler require at Templo Mayor? Above all, a sense for genuine and sustained amazement. This was a great culture which was suppressed, and yet its amazing capacity to retain greatness among its own ruins still moves us. The latter, however, can suddenly pose problems for which there is no solution. For example, how to be a traveler along the terrains of a civilization for which the clues that are key to its mysteries have vanished with the passing of time, and whose remnants have only come to us by the formidable visual impact of its works of art. We now stand at what was once the main temple of the great Aztec civilization. We find ourselves before the Sonpantli, a marvelous mural made of human skulls, which immediately relates us to all mythologies dealing with that intimate and incestuous relationship between Mexicans and death. A traveler going along these ruins is also required to possess specific data on how the suppression of the cultural codes of the ancient Mexicans was part of a policy of conquest at first, and later a policy of shame and guilt towards one of the roots of our nationality. It was only very recently that it was possible to speak of a national recovery of the Indian past. This recovery is owed largely to museums. Museums have provided a setting for transmission of knowledge and have prompted us to reach a state of curiosity and awe. And the major temple museum has constituted, so to speak, a ceremonial center for the traveler's amazement. This is why it makes sense to visit this place and try to understand it in our own terms and to some extent those of its builders, which purpose it served, how life was organized around the buildings, how theology constituted a major part of daily life, the way in which these skulls, sculptures, and monuments were not regarded as art objects, but prime elements of religious practice. I have never allowed myself to assume a paternalistic attitude in the face of the past, which is a very common attitude. We tend to look at the Indian past as something which is there for us to patronizingly pat on the back and give credit to the effort undertaken by our forebears, given their circumstances, to create art. I believe that this attitude is entirely mistaken. As a matter of fact, in recent years, the Museum of Modern Art in New York correctly added quotation marks to the adjective primitive in order to stress the impossibility of continuing to judge that past by contemporary Western standards. Indeed, gazing at these pieces, whose quality can only be judged as outstanding, the label primitive turns out to be not only misleading but insulting as well. As a traveler, the main advice that I can give to myself is that we are in the presence of works of art fit for comparison to the finest artistic expressions of any given historical period and any given historical culture. During the 50s, a mystifying, almost infantile debate took place concerning a book written about the goddess Coatlicue. It was argued that this Aztec divinity wasn't fit to stand analysis by European methods of art evaluation. It was further said that Coatlicue was an object of purely historical and archaeological importance, yet by no means capable of being subjected to aesthetic analysis. This claim clearly evidenced what later would vanish thanks to the existence of museums: paternalism regarding the past, disbelief in the face of what these creations represented, values which were clearly distant from classical art, yet classics in their own right. There was a presence of racism, but most importantly, of intolerance with respect to aesthetic forms that deviated from accepted values. It was thanks to museums that the concept of a different kind of beauty was established. Towards this aim were also helpful the hundreds of thousands of scholarly works produced all over the world, which highlighted the quality of these pieces. Another helpful element was the influence that these creations exerted over world-class sculptors. In addition, the case for Aztec art was further boosted by the visitors who have flocked here in the millions to find in them, once they are able to ascertain their intrinsic worth, a source both of amazement and even of national pride. These museums, which are now always full of children overflowing with joy, which is a form of curiosity which eventually will be transformed into the acquisition of knowledge, currently house a different aesthetic understanding, which now enables us to understand that we cannot be paternalistic or patronizing with respect to a past that, regardless of time and circumstance, was able to create works of art of an awesome nature. In the case of Templo Mayor, and specifically in regard to these amazing figures, I find it increasingly clear that it is impossible to remain insensitive to that reverence which in turn puts us in touch with that other reverence that our forebears once felt in their presence. Indeed, we lack the cosmological feelings of the Aztecs, yet our modern aesthetic concepts become a replacement for the ancient emotion of divinity, thus enabling us to gaze into a world whose key elements had long been denied to us. In a most notable book, the Mexican writer Alfonso Reyes evoked in his finest prose the daily life of Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital. In it, there is a celebrated sentence which is both a nostalgic dictum and a painful reminiscence. Halt, traveler, you have arrived at the most transparent region in the air. It is also necessary to point out that in the words of Bernal Díaz del Castillo and other chroniclers of the period, the Spanish conquerors arrived in a city of manifest architectural greatness which captivated and fascinated them in spite of the hostility that they felt for the barbaric practices that they supposed ruled the land. The notable progress of Mexican archaeology allows us to enjoy this model that recreates for us Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital upon whose raised ramparts the conquering Spaniards built what is now Mexico City. It is a useful tool for those of us who attempt to understand the mechanisms used by the Aztecs for enhancing the grandeur of their culture. At first glance, we find evidence of this taste for majestic dimensions with which they aimed at reducing the feelings of the inhabitants to their most humbling. Architecture was again the measure for all things, and human beings should surrender to this evidence. Those in control of the buildings and palaces were by virtue of their control to be regarded as divine and superior. The architectural myths that they had created conferred upon them the maximum degree of authority. Once again, architecture functioned as a means of domination as well as a method of learning the insignificance of the individual before the colossal dimensions of the institutions and their rulers. In these temples, pyramids, and palaces, the aim was to diminish individual perspective and remind the men and women who inhabited the city that they should pay tribute twofold. Firstly, by blind obedience, and secondly, by remaining constantly in awe. What remains unclear is the reaction of those who inhabited the city. We may, of course, deduce that they lived in subjugation. We may also deduce that they lived in awe at both the rulers and their buildings of majestic dimensions. We also lack information on their aesthetic concepts, what the latter were, how they reacted before given stimuli, what expectations they had, what were their dreams and desires. All that we have nowadays are the poems, which fortunately for us have been translated into Spanish and thus provide us with a unique tool for approaching an idiosyncrasy which would otherwise result foreign to us. Our other source of information is the perseveration of an artistic style. This style seemed so beautiful to them that they repeated it and transformed it along the way. So strong was the belief in its capacity to cause amazement that they decreed it worthy of being repeated and preserved by means of that constant tribute which lies in the continuity in artistic procedures. With the passing of time, we have come to learn that this architectural procedure also served the purpose of instilling amazement in a form that we now identify as aesthetic. That amazement, which was felt by the Aztecs by the sheer dimensions of their temples and palaces as well as their distribution, is the same kind of amazement that was caused by the sculptures, which for them meant an artistic means by which to communicate with the hereafter and the procedures and visions of the sacred beings. At this point, we cannot help recognizing that Tenochtitlan was also an aesthetical fact. And in spite of its political importance and the humiliating effect sought by its architectural scale, it was also quite willing to captivate and seduce by means of what we now call aesthetic feelings and sensations. The historian Edmundo O'Gorman explained it quite well. America was invented rather than discovered. In a similar way, we could sustain that Coyolxauhqui and the other unique pieces of art that are a part of this museum have been recovered rather than discovered. And that recovery not only affects archaeology by providing a cause for the existence of this museum, but is also a source of pride not only for Mexicans in their heritage, but to all those willing to make another culture their own through the emotion it can produce upon them. This film shows scenes from the original recovery of the Coyolxauhqui, the star piece of the Museum of Templo Mayor. This recovery, as it is well known, began by chance, and it became a systematic endeavor, which was the source of debates and that finally rests here as a testimony of a culture that is transformed along the way into a means for reshaping the idea of nationality. Like all archaeological recoveries, it affects the idea of nationality not because the nation can be modified by the mere recovery of pieces, but because the aesthetic pride is already one of the vanities, if you wish, or the legitimate sources for collective boasting. This piece, for example, will allow, as so many others at the Anthropological Museum have allowed, for parents to contaminate their children and instill in them the need to affirm themselves, not in arrogance or chauvinism, but in the knowledge of a culture which in turn provides them not only with an identity, but that need to find themselves in the company of the best objects that have been produced here, and that which can be shared internationally. What one discovers at museums is the continuing process of learning that parents, students, visitors, and even members of what is known as our illustrated elite all share in common. The continuing process of learning about what our past was, and of the ways in which to approach this past. And with this unique piece, the end result is that the recovery is not only archaeological or belonging to the realm of our cultural heritage, but also includes the idea which we have about ourselves to the extent to which we are moved by its greatness.